Okay, you can't see me. I got my safety glasses on. I'm ready to go. We're going to do a full brake inspection on this vehicle, and I will take the time to show you exactly what I'm doing. We'll start first with the front brakes, and then we're going to move on to the back brakes. Okay, so for the most part, you'll be seeing the car as it goes up. I've got this camera set up so that you'll be focused on the wheel. So I'll be speaking, and you probably maybe notice my hands, and that's it. I don't want to go too far off because I want you guys to have a better view of what I'm doing on this tire, okay? All right, so let's take the car up. Here's what I've done. I've already set myself up. So I've got all the tools that I need here to do the inspection. So I've got Allen keys, because we need the Allen keys to take the bolts out that hold the caliper. I've got a flexible socket. So I've got a flexible impact 3/8 drive socket. Now, because I'm using the impact gun has a 1/2-inch drive. I can't use a 1/2-inch drive on a 3/8 drive socket. So what I need is what's called a step down adapter. So I've got it right here. So it's going to go from 1/2-inch to 3/8. And by doing this, we step it down, and now it can be connected to my socket, my flexible socket. That's going to be to take off the caliper bracket so that I can remove the rotor. I've got my brake pad thickness gauge here. What's nice about this is it just kind of makes it easy for us to quickly measure the brake pads. It's not exact, but it's very, very close, okay? I've got a pair of side cutter pliers, and what this is going to be used for is to remove the spring. I've got an anti-rattle spring on this brakes assembly, all right? Got my electric 3/8 drive ratchet, okay? That's going to be to remove the 2 bolts that secure the caliper to the caliper bracket, okay? And as usual, I know I've got a bright light shining on this work area here. That's for the video so you guys can see it better. But I've also got a light here in case I need a light inside the vehicle when I'm working on it, right? And there's a couple of different positions I can put it on. All right. Oh, I got to get one more thing. I've got to get an extension. I'm going to need a solid extension for the rear brakes simply because of where the caliper brackets are and where the bolts are that secure the caliper to the actual caliper bracket, okay? Now, I'm hoping that you guys have spent a little bit of time taking a look at some of the ElecTube videos that we've got, because I know we've got some really great videos on the calipers. We've got some great videos explaining the construction of the brake pads, which is what we did yesterday. But their videos are a little bit more interactive. And I know what I explained to you guys yesterday, you probably, all of you understand. But by taking a look at the ElecTube video, it just gives you a little bit more information, okay? I'm filling up my reservoirs so I can go up. That was just the hood, guys. The hood closed on me. I like to keep the hood open as I work on my vehicles. I don't need to keep the hood open for this particular procedure because it's just checking the brakes. I just prefer to keep the hood open. Now, this procedure isn't going to take too long. All right, our car's up in the air. I've got it at chest height. All right, Airline. Throw on some gloves. Don't really need to throw on gloves, but I just like to. All right, we're hooking up our air tool. Got power. Let's get this wheel off. Now, what I'm going to do just to save some time, I'm taking the wheels off, and no, I won't save any time. I'll just normally I would go to the back and I would take that wheel off because I've got the gun, but we'll do that later. Okay, that's another procedure which is in the back. So, what I told you guys yesterday was when you're working on a European car that has bolts instead of nuts, all right, you have to make sure that when you take your final bolt out of the rim assembly or wheel assembly, you want to kind of hold it. So what I do is I just kind of take my hand and I push on this rim just to kind of hold the rim. So right now the rim is just kind of balancing on the center hub here, okay? And you can see it's not falling off, okay? Because I just kind of kept my hand here. I applied pressure this way, all right? The wheel doesn't fall off. So where it balances is on the center hub here. So the rim just kind of bounces on the center hub. What we're going to do now is we're going to take out the caliper. I'm going to show you what we're going to do. Let me swing this out. You know what? I've got the car in park. You guys won't see this. I've just got to bring the car down. I've got to take it out of park. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the steering wheel to the right. And by turning the steering wheel to the right, I'm going to expose the caliper bracket and the caliper to my work area. So if you guys see what I'm doing, my wheel is being turned and I'm exposing it. Okay, so I'm turning it all the way to the left. I'll leave a little bit and I'll show you what I'm doing. So if you're paying attention to that wheel, it's now turned to the right. By turning my wheel to the right, it exposes my caliper bolts. So I've turned the wheel out, and if you didn't notice that the wheel was turning out to the right, I'll turn it the remainder of the way. So the wheel was turning out to the right, and I can pull it the last couple of inches, okay? So now that we've got this, we've got a better view of what we've got to do in here, and I should be able to swing this over. Okay, and I always lose this camera, so let me just get the camera back up. I think it has to do with the cable. But whenever I physically just kind of move this around, I lose this USB camera. And I know I've got it spotlighted. So nope, this is not the USB. This is, there we go. All right, so we're back up. And we've got the caliper assembly. So we've got the caliper assembly visible here, and you guys can clearly see that. All right, so we've got my caliper assembly here. What I have to do to take this off, like I showed you guys yesterday, is very, very simple, okay? I've got two caps, okay? So I've got a cap here, and I've got a cap in the back. And I've got these rubber boots that go over it. And then I've got these rubber plugs that go in the boot, and that kind of protects the 2 bolts that hold the caliper assembly to the bracket. That protects it, okay? Just gonna change my clothes. So much better to use these ones. Right? In industry, nobody, well, a lot of guys use the mechanics gloves. I just prefer to use these. This is what I use in industry. So we use these blue nitrile gloves, right? When we first started, when I was working at the dealership, they used to actually give us latex gloves, but a lot of people have developed allergic reactions to latex gloves. So they've gone nitrile, and nitrile are a lot more durable than latex, all right? So I've taken out the 2 bolts, the 2 caps from here, 2 plastic caps from here. I'm gonna take out the spring next, all right? And if I swing it back again this way, you guys should see this, okay? So if I swing it back out, I'm gonna remove this anti-rattle clip. And this anti-rattle clip is set up so that it doesn't allow this caliper to kind of vibrate. And it also kind of holds the pads kind of from vibrating around, all right? So that's why they call it an anti-rattle clip. Clip is out. At 1 o'clock, I know I was speaking to Hans earlier. At 1 o'clock, they're supposed to make an announcement as to whether or not we're going to be coming back. If you guys were coming back to school, I mean, I would get you guys up in the shop and running, and we would have some fun, and you guys would learn how to use some of these tools. One of the things that I always tell my students in class is you want to make sure that if you're working on the hoist, that you put all of your pieces, so all of the parts that you take off of the car, especially if you're working on brakes, you just want to kind of put them on the hoist arm, all right? And one of the amusing things that I always tell my students is if you're working on the floor, you want to make sure that any kind of nuts or bolts that you take off from the vehicle, you put them under the jack stand so that they're protected, right? And my way of saying that, and you know, making a point of it, I always tell the students in the class, you want to protect your nuts, okay? By protecting your nuts, no one's going to kick them around, because if you leave something on the floor, so if you've got something on the floor, right, you've got small little nuts and bolts on the floor where someone that's walking by could possibly either one, step on them or kick them, okay? You've just lost your nuts and your bolts, all right? If you lose your nuts and your bolts, you can't put these things back together. So one of the amusing things I always tell the students is protect your nuts, all right? So when you take stuff off, nuts, bolts, whatever you take off. So my 2 little rubber caps are here, my spring is here. You want to protect them from getting moved, all right? One of the other things that you don't want to do is when you take them out, you don't want to put them in your pocket, because if you put them in your pocket and then you walk away, especially here in the school setting, you walk away for lunch, you walk away, peers over. Now I've got to put something back together, and if all of the parts that I need to put it back together aren't here, then that's a problem, right? Most of the time I'm looking at I've got shop coats, and a lot of the times what I'll do is I have to rifle through the shop coats and look in the pockets, because students have put the nuts and the bolts they've taken off in the pockets of those shop coats. Well, that's a no-no, right? So what you want to do is you want to keep it near to the area that you're working in, and you want to put it in an area where they're not going to get kicked around and lost, okay? Caliper's got to come off. I've removed the caps, okay, from these little rubber spots here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get the proper size Allen key. All right, so there's my Allen key, and I always have I just pull the whole rail out, makes it easier. So I think it's this one. Nope. So like this. Yeah, that's it there. So I've got my Allen key set up in here. Take my electric, and I've got electric, and I've also got air, right? So the only reason I like to use the electric is it's not quite as loud as the air electric. I'm gonna pull this bolt right out, and if I pull it all the way out, you guys get the benefit of seeing what the bolt looks like. So I can't pull it all the way out this way. It's not meant to come out all the way, but I can if I put a. Now again, you guys are pulling these things out. I see students, and I mean, you guys don't have the experience that I do. I see students that will try and pull the bolt right out. Okay, you don't have to pull the bolt right out. Why? Because it's not necessary to pull the bolt right out. Here's the bolt that I've got. This car's a 2006. All right, it's a 2006. This is 2021. The car is now 15 years old. All right, look at this bolt. This is the sliding pin bolt. Okay, that's the sliding pin bolt for the caliper assembly, and it looks brand new. All right, and the reason why it looks brand new, sorry, I'm just looking down at my screen to see what I'm showing you. The reason that it looks brand new is because it's kind of encased in a rubber protective boot, and that doesn't allow any water in there to damage it. And there's the Allen key head on it. So with the female Allen key head on it, okay, all you have to do is find the correct size male Allen key, and then they just kind of fit together. All right, and that's how they work. And one of the reasons why I was saying that a lot of the manufacturers, the European manufacturers, trying to move away from this kind of Allen key head. If you see this here, to damage that, especially when it gets rusty, it's quite easy. All right, so a lot of them have moved away from these types of bolts to a regular bolt with a hexagonal head. Right. So if you've got a 6-pointer hexagonal head on it, it's a lot easier to work with something like this than with something like this. And then really you don't need any special tools, all right? We've got all the special tools, so we've got all the Allen key tools here. But most people will be working with things like this. Most people will just be working with sockets, right? And the sockets are the female and they go over the male, right? Okay, so I've got the one bolt out. Second bolt will come out. And again, you don't need to take these bolts right out. I just took them out just for display purposes so that you guys can see the actual bolt. I'm just going to slide it back into the caliper, okay? Sliding it back into the caliper just to kind of keep it there. So, two. So, I've taken the 2 bolts out. I've taken the spring out in the front. Now I can remove the caliper. One of the things that I wanted to show you, and I said, okay, there's an additional problem on this car. When we're doing inspections on vehicles, one of the things that we do is while we're under this area, so while we're working on the vehicle, you want to look for signs of other sort of either wear, or tear, or damage. And one of the things that I discovered quite a while ago on this is this. And if I bring this closer, get this closer. Hopefully I don't lose my camera. I lost the camera, sorry. Okay, so set the camera back up. Okay, so one of the all right. Not sure why this camera is going down. All right, so one of the things that we noticed on this particular vehicle is the brake hose. All right, so when we're doing more studying on this, what you'll realize is the braking system on a vehicle, okay, on a passenger car, light truck, it's fluid or hydraulic. Okay, so the braking system on a passenger vehicle or a light truck is a hydraulic system. So it works with fluid. On the bigger commercial industrial vehicles, they don't really use hydraulic systems. They use air systems. So they've got like a pneumatic brake system. And the reason for that, I think, is just simply because if you've got a really, really big tractor and a trailer, the amount of brake fluid that you would need for that system would be quite large. And then if you've got a leak in it, now you've got an awful lot of brake fluid being leaked out. The amount or the capacity of brake fluid in a regular passenger vehicle or light truck is around maybe 300 to 500 milliliters of fluid. So that's not a lot. But when we're talking about something like a tractor trailer, which has a 24-inch trailer in the back, now you've got all these lines filled with fluid. I think you'd probably be looking easily at, maybe 1.5 liters, maybe 2 liters of fluid. And you get to 1.5 liters, 2 liters of brake fluid leaking out. That's a kind of a problem. So a lot of the bigger transportation vehicles, land transportation vehicles, they use air or pneumatic systems, whereas we use fluid. So one of the things that we need in either an air system or a fluid system is we need something to transmit the fluid. And one of the things that we have, obviously, is the brake. This is a brake hose. All right. So the brake hose transmits the fluid to transmit the force to come to the caliper. I'm not going to explain how the caliper works, because when we look at some of the videos, if you guys have watched some of the videos, it's quite simple. All right. So Electude has some great animation, which we'll look at to show you guys how the caliper works. But let's take the caliper off. Before I do that, maybe you guys can see this. This brake hose is in no way compromised because it can't really break or burst. But what's happened is the car's quite old. And if you're seeing me pulling this back here, if I should, let me shine more light on this, okay? What we did when we did the inspection, we found that this brake hose here, all right, the rubber, you've got like a rubber sleeve that goes over the brake hose. The brake hose underneath has material that gives it the strength that it needs in order so that it doesn't burst under pressure, all right? And then you've got this rubber cover that just kind of protects that. Well, what's happened on this, and we noticed this years ago, this little rubber protective sleeve that goes over it, it's just kind of cracked right here. Does it pose a danger? No, I'm driving the car, so I'm not going to drive a car that poses a danger to me. But that hose should be replaced. When we go to the other side, you'll see that I've already replaced that hose on the other side. So, but this hose needs to be replaced, okay? It is not in any way a safety issue, and that's why it hasn't been replaced as yet. But it has been noted that the little rubber, okay, the rubber sleeve on the outside of this brake hose, okay, it is cracked. If you guys notice me looking down, not in the camera, it's just simply because I've got the monitor of the computer down at the bottom, and that's why I'm looking down. So let's take a look. Let's get this caliper off. So what I showed you guys yesterday on the brake assembly was how to remove the caliper. But that caliper didn't have the hose connected to it. And I made a point of saying, okay, well, if there's no hose connected to it, it makes it easy. I can just put it anywhere. When you remove the caliper of the brakes on a vehicle, you don't want to hang the caliper by this hose. So what you've got to do is you've got to get, and I keep them in the shop, what you've got to do is you've got to get a piece of either metal wire or some sort of hanging mechanism, and you've got to be able to take this, all right, and you want to hang the caliper, and you're going to suspend the caliper. You've usually got the strut. If I pan up on this, you can see the strut, all right? So if I kind of move the camera up, we've got a strut here, and the strut has a coil spring. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this little hook, and I'm going to hook this right onto here. Okay. So now I've got the perfect little like hanger to hang my caliper. So when I take my caliper off, let's put this back down. I take the caliper back, kind of rock it. And what you'll notice with this caliper is that the inside pad will come out with the caliper because it's got a little clip on it. So let's just do this. Now, If I just wanted to show you quickly, I might as well since we're here. Yesterday I showed you the window. All right, so you've got the window in the caliper, and in this window, it allows you to look at the actual brake pad. I'm not gonna move this any closer, but I know there's enough light and I can see what you guys are seeing, and you can see the brake pad here. Let me make a quick measurement of my brake pad. I've got my brake pad thickness gauge here, and I just simply slide this in. So I'm gonna slide it in to see which one matches. And just like yesterday, I think the one that kind of fit in was this one. Okay, so now I don't have green, I've got a yellow, which just simply means caution. All right, it's not in the red. I'm not in the red. I'm actually in the first yellow. So I'm just right off of the last green. All right, so we've got thickest, obviously middle grade, and then the lowest grade for the green, and I'm in the first of the yellows. So if I'm looking at it and I'm reading what it says that I've got 6 millimeters. That's what it says on the actual, on this yellow gauge here. It says 6 millimeters. So I know my pads are at 6 millimeters, and what I know is when these pads are brand new, they're probably around 10 to maybe 12 millimeters. So I'm still at about 50% pad, all right? But I've got a problem with my rotor, and when I drive this car at high speeds and I press on the brakes, anything over, say, about 80 kilometers an hour, the pedal vibrates. So that's the complaint that you would be getting from the customer. The pedal is vibrating. So I've just made a quick measurement here, and if I wanted to measure the outside, here's what I do. And again, these are great. And these are great because you can take a quick measurement, and what I'm gonna do here is I can measure the outside brake pad, and this tool, the flat surface here, it's meant to go up against the rotor, and then I just take it up against the rotor like this, and now I can measure the thickness of my outside pad. And again, I'm measuring my outside pad, and it's just about 6 millimeters, which is almost the same as my inside, which means that everything is wearing properly. What you want to see on a vehicle, if you've got 5 millimeters on the outside pad, you want to see 5 millimeters on the inside pad. That means that everything is moving nice and freely. Now, if you've got 5 millimeters on the outside pad and you've got 2 millimeters on the inside pad, means something is sticking. So when we're applying the brakes, the caliper's job is to squeeze the brake pads. Now we squeeze the brake pads against the rotor. So we're squeezing the pads against the rotor to slow it down. If you've got the outside pad that's nice and free, once we release the caliper, so we squeeze the caliper in, okay, we squeeze the pads against the rotor, we slow down the rotor. We slow down the rotor, we slow down the tire, we slow down the tire, we slow down the car. If you're squeezing the pads in, and when we release the brakes, the pads don't come back, the pads will stay dragging on the surface of the rotor. And if the pads stay dragging on the surface of the rotor, they get the rotor hot, they get the pad hot. We could have a situation where you've got the lining material, like I showed you yesterday, heating up, getting so hot that the glue loses its adhesive qualities because you've overheated the glue. And now you're going to have a lining that's going to separate from the backing plate. So 6 and 6 means everything is moving properly. If I had 5 and I had 2 on the inside, means the inside pad is sticking. And what's going on is when we press the brake pads against the rotor, because they're sticking, they're not coming off of the rotor. So as the rotor is spinning, it's wearing down the brake pad. It's also wearing down the rotor, but not as much as the pad. Let's swing this back out. Caliper is going to come off. I'm going to pull it off. I'm going to pull it off this way. So as I'm pulling it off, I have a pretty good view. I've got the caliper almost out. All right, so the caliper is almost out. This way you can see the caliper is almost out. All right, so there's the caliper. I'm just going to pull it off so that it clears the brake pads. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang it on this little hanger. So my caliper is not hanging by, the hose. Okay, so I'm just going to hang it. And when I do that, now my caliper is not hanging by my brake hose. I'm going to actually pull this out. So what I just did there was I just took this out and I put that hanger over that bolt goes. So now my caliper is hanging, but it's hanging by this little hanger, if you want to call it that, that little piece of, I don't know, little piece of wire, if you want to call it that. So now it's hanging by the wire, it's not hanging by the hose. My outside pad, okay, there's my outside pad, all right, and there's lots of lining left, 6 millimeters from here to here. We've got lots of lining, all right. Inside here, we've got, I might as well show you this because this is noted in your lead tube. So in lead tube, when you're looking, they actually talk about this little, there's like a little groove in the middle of the pad. And I don't think this groove goes all the way down. No, it doesn't. There's a little groove in the pad. And what it tells you in the lead tube is once you've worn past that, pads have to be replaced. Well, on this particular car, this groove doesn't go that deep, all right? So this groove should be going down a little bit deeper. We've got about 50% pad left here, so it's still okay. Once you get down to anywhere, say from 30 or less, you want to change the pad. But you can clearly see that there's a little bit of groove left here. And I don't think there's anything underneath because there's no groove here. So it looks like the end of the groove, but these pads are still okay. So I'm going to show you what we're going to do to these pads when we put it back in, because we're going to kind of service it back up before we put it back together. But let me show you what's wrong with these. Okay, so outside pad. My inside pad is connected to my caliper. And if you guys can see this, okay, I had something. My inside pad is connected with the caliper. So my inside brake pad is connected to the caliper because there's a little clip on the pad. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to pull it away. So on my inside pad, I've got these kind of spring clips here. Okay. And these spring clips hold it to my piston. So these spring clips are meant to pop into my piston hole here, and they hold the inside pad right to my caliper, okay, through these clips. There's my inside pad. You can see that my pad assembly has lots of lining left. So there's lots of lining left right here, okay, and we measured it at 6 millimeters. But look, there's no groove because these particular pads, they just don't have a groove that goes all the way down. So inside pad, and how do you tell the difference? Now, some of you might not take this course in grade 12, and some of you, maybe later might want to, again, I didn't get you guys in this shop. You don't have any of the hands-on experience that you should be getting. How do you tell the difference between the inside pad and the outside pad? And that's really, really critical. Because if you guys are taking the brakes apart on your vehicle, when you take it apart, you want to put the inside pad on the inside and the outside pad back on the outside. So one of the things I always tell students is just to quickly look at it. When you're looking at the pads, there's some visual clues. So when you're looking at the pads, the inside pad will always have this circle. And that circle is from the piston of the caliper. So that piston of the caliper is what squeezes this pad up against the rotor. And that's the inside pad because it's got this circle. And that circular mark is from the piston of the brake caliper. The outside pad, again, we're talking about vehicles that have a floating type caliper. And I'm going to say 90% of the vehicles on the road today have floating calipers. And then you've got that 10% that have got fixed calipers. Okay, those are the higher performance vehicles, ones with more power from the engine, right? The exotics, right? All the Lamborghinis, all the Ferraris, all the Porsches, they've all got fixed calipers. The outside pads on a fixed caliper assembly will have the marks from these two things here. So we've got the forks, okay? And you've got two forks that kind of hold to the outside pad. And take a look at the pad. You've got this mark and you've got this mark. All right, so this mark and this mark are from the forks which are located on the outside of the brake caliper. So outside pad with the marks here and here from forks, and then you've got inside pad, and it's got a little circle, and that circle is from piston on the caliper. I want to show you what's wrong on this particular vehicle. Let me hang this caliper. So we're doing a full brake inspection on this car, and the complaint from the customer is, I got a vibration in my brake pedal. So like the brake pedal vibrates. We call that a pulsation, but the customer is going to call it a vibration, which is what everyone knows what a vibration is. So if you've got a vibration from your brake pedal, once you're braking at about 80 kilometers or higher, you know that there's something wrong with this, okay? Because this rotor, as it's spinning around and around, it's supposed to spin around and around, but not wobble from left to side, left to right. And what's happening is because of the rust buildup on this, and you can't see it on the outside. I've got to take it off and I've got to show it to you. Once we take off this bracket, you'll see the rust buildup on the inside of this rotor, and that's what's causing the little vibration. Because what's happening on the brake system is the caliper has a piston, and this piston uses hydraulic fluid to transfer the force. So if we've got a piston right here that uses hydraulic force, this obviously has to have fluid behind it. So here's what happens. The fluid behind it, okay, gets transmitted through the brake line, and you can see the brake line here. I've got the brake line, and it goes through the brake line, back through the master cylinder, and that pulsation coming from the fluid goes right back to the brake pedal. We'll discuss this when we're looking at hydraulic principles of the braking system. Let's swing this out. Swing this out. It's over because it's kind of touching. I'm going to swing this out. And then what do we have? What we have in the back here is two bolts. So we've got a bolt here and a bolt here, and I've got to take them out because these two bolts hold this bracket, this caliper bracket. And once I remove the caliper bracket, we can remove the rotor. So I've got to take out the caliper bracket, and that's what this is for. So that's what these were for. I brought this, it's a 50mm flexible socket. Okay, and I'm just going to put my gun on them just to take them out. When I put them back in, I'm actually going to use a wrench. But for now, to take them out, I'm just going to use the gun. All right? So let me get this on first. So see what you guys see. So if I come here, that's not the way. All right, so you guys can see my gun. I'm just going to take out the bolt. That bolt is obviously tight. But my gun right now doesn't have enough power to take it out, and that's fine. Here, that one's out. Try this one again. Nope. So we've got the top one out, but I'm not going to take it all the way out. Okay, somebody help me out. What do I need to take this bolt out? The gun won't take it out, so what am I going to use? Anybody have any idea? Turn on your microphone and tell me what I need to use. What do I need to use? All right, so I can't see the chat because of what I'm doing, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get me a long bar. So if I get me a long bar, all right, that'll have a lot of torque. I'm going to put my socket on the long bar, or ratchet if you want to call it that, but I'm going to use what's called the breaker bar, and we have them here, the L handle. Let me get it. And the L handle is located in cabinet M. And I know what I need for a socket. So I need a socket. I'm going to use a black socket because the black socket are the impact sockets, okay? And I'm going to use my breaker bar. So the breaker bar that I've got here is an 18-inch breaker bar. And I've got my socket. So now I've got my socket on my breaker bar, and all I'm going to do is this. I'm going to put it on, and because I've got a really long handle on this, I should be able to break this bolt. So what I mean by break the bolt is I'm not actually breaking the bolt. What I'm doing is I'm breaking the initial torque on the bolt, and then once I break the initial torque, it makes it loose. So let me just, I'm probably going to lose the camera again, but let's just try and see if I can bring it back. Okay, so if I bring this back ever so slightly, I might lose the camera. Nope. I'm trying to do this as delicately as possible. Yep, lost the camera. I apologize. All right, so I'll show you what I'm doing, and by moving this out a little bit further, you guys should be okay. Okay, so no. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not working with the best of equipment. This is not a movie studio, but I'm doing what I can here. So, all right, so I've got the long breaker bar here, and all I'm going to do, I'm going to push down because that's the way to loosen it. And by using this long breaker bar, I've got lots of torque. So you heard that kind of like crunch, okay? What we've done is we've removed the initial torque, and okay, so now I've loosened it. So now that bolt is loose. And once the bolt is loose, because I've used this long breaker bar on it, I can put my gun back on it. We can take out the bolts. So let me just bring this back over. Okay, all right, so we're good. All right, so 2 bolts, we're going to take them out. Now, because they're loose, I don't really have to use, because we've loosened the bolts, I can now use my 3/8 ratchet, and I can take those 2 bolts out. So let's just take them out. Let me show you what's happening here. 1 bolt is out, 2nd bolt is out. Now I know what's going to happen, so I'm going to have to come over to the other side. I'm going to have to hold the bracket, because if I don't hold the bracket, this bracket's going to fall out. So I've got the 2 bolts out. And once I've got the bolts out, I've got a steering bracket and I've got my caliper bracket, and they would both fall out if I'm not holding. So I've got steering bracket out with the 2 bolts. This is just a steering stop for the vehicle. So when you're turning, it kind of stops the wheels from turning excessively. That's what this is. This is a steering stop bracket here. And then right here is my caliper bracket. Okay, so you've got the 2 big bolts that hold it to the knuckle. And then you've got the 2 smaller bolts that hold the brake caliper to the bracket. Now, let's take a look at what's wrong with this. There's great light here. I've got to take the rotor off. But in order to take the rotor off, I've got to take out a little bolt that holds it. So there's a little 10mm bolt here. I'm just going to take that out quickly. I just need my 10mm socket. Socket, 3/8 drive. And I know that this bolt is not going to be seized. Why? Because we've worked on it many, many times, and we always make sure that when we take our nuts and our bolts out, we normally lubricate them. And if we lubricate them, it never seize. So I've taken out that little bolt. So there's just a little bolt that holds the rotor onto the hub. And I'm being very, very careful. I don't want this rotor to drop on me. So it's balancing right now on the hub, and that's okay. So now, when you look at this rotor, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to show it to you. So on this side of the rotor, Okay, it doesn't look too bad, right? It looks okay. Now there's a little lip here, so I can feel it with my finger. So there's a rust lip here, but take a look at the back. Okay, and this rotor is quite old. I'm not sure how old. It's not as old as the car. I've replaced them before, but I've got this huge rust lip here, and this rust lip is probably causing me the grief. So if I could remove the rust lip, that would be good. And I can put it on the lathe to remove the rust lip, but I don't want to. We've got like 60% pad left, or 50% pad left, and I can just easily just place the rotors, replace the pads, do a complete brake job on this car, and that would get rid of it. I could also drop it on the ground, which I'm going to do right now. But I didn't remove much rust because it's not that badly rusted. The rotor itself is pretty good. We've just got our huge rust lip on the back. So I just kind of dropped it on the ground to kind of clean it up a little bit, but I didn't remove much of this rust. So if you guys are looking at this rust here, okay, what you can see with the reflection of the light is, take a look right here. It's kind of cracked off some of the rust. You see it there? So we've kind of cracked off some of the rust, but we haven't taken it all off. So this is the problem on this particular vehicle. We've got the brake hose that's got a slight crack in the outside rubber protective skin, if you want to call it. And then we've got these rotors, and because the rotors are badly rusted, that's what's causing the vibration at the pedal that the customer is complaining about. Okay? The rest of it doesn't look too bad. Okay, I've got a hub here that's in great condition. So there's my hub. It's in great condition. Every time we take parts off of vehicles in this shop, we always use lubricants. And the reason that we use lubricants is because by using a lubricant on these parts won't ever seize together. So whenever we take a nut or a bolt out, we always lube it back up. And the reason we do that is for longevity, all right? The more lube we put on nuts and bolts, especially in high critical areas, all right, the easier it is for us to take it off at a later date. So these bolts here that I just took out of this bracket, so these bolts are in the bracket. I'm going to make sure that I put just a little bit. We're not going to go crazy. We're just going to put a little bit of lubricant on the threads. And I'll show you how we do that. We've got time. So we might as well put this back together, and I'll show you exactly what I'm going to do. All right? We're going to put it back together. But before we put it back together, there is lubricant on here. And you can kind of tell that there's lubricant on here because of the color. So we've got like this kind of copper color, and our lubricant that we use, it's a synthetic lubricant. It can withstand a lot of heat, all right? So it's like, it's a moly lubricant because it's synthetic. And let me just go and get it. This is the only thing that I didn't bring. So I'm going to try and show you the one that's, I usually cut the lids off of these, but this one here is tall enough for you guys to see it, okay? So we call it copper slip, but there's other ones called moly slip. The only reason this one's called copper slip, it's moly slip, but it's got copper in it. And that's why it kind of looks like that color, because it's got a little bit of copper in it to give it that color. So what this moly slip does, they call it anti-seize, all right? So they call it anti-seize compound, and it provides protection at about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 3 times as hot as your oven gets, right? Because your oven goes up to about 500 degrees, I believe. This will stay in this state, all right? So this synthetic lubricant will not melt, all right? So if any of you remember this, and you can all remember this, your mom cooks a nice meal, or your dad cooks a nice meal, or even you cook a nice meal. It's a nice chicken dinner. You know, you do the chicken in the oven, and you cook some rice with it. And what do you have with the chicken? You've got a really nice gravy because you've got all that fat from the chicken. that's now kind of turned into a nice gravy, right? And you pour that on top of your rice. You got a nice dinner. What happens once that gets cold? Once that gets cold, the fat from the chicken that's melted when it's warm, okay, turns into like a grease almost. So it turns white, it gets thicker, all right? And it's not as fluid as it was as when you warm it up. So what we want, okay, what we want from a grease is we want a grease that will stay in this form, okay, like that chicken fat, all right? We want it to stay in this form even when it's really, really hot. And on brakes, it's super critical because when we brake a vehicle, the kinetic energy in the rotor is turned into heat into the pads. And so now everything gets hot. If we do not use a synthetic lubricant on our brakes, what ends up happening is this grease that looks like this, all right? Once it gets hot, it will melt and it will turn into a liquid. And we don't want a liquid on our brakes. If we've got any kind of oil, okay, in a liquid form in our braking system, what's going to end up happening is we're going to introduce oil or some sort of lubricant between the brake pads and the surface of the rotor. So if we've got a lubricant on the rotor surface, okay, on the rotor surface and touching the brake pads, what we've just done now is we've reduced the coefficient of friction. So when I say reducing the coefficient of friction, what I mean is it's not quite as sticky as it was, right? So the higher your coefficient of friction, the stickier two things are to each other. So when we reduce the coefficient of friction, means it's kind of slippery. Do we want pads and rotors being slippery to each other when we press on the brakes? No, we want the brake pads to kind of stick to the rotors. And if we introduce a lubricant, that's not good, okay? So we're gonna put this back together. I'll put links to the brake pads. I'll show you guys what I've done. This vehicle does need rotors. It doesn't need pads right now, but if I'm gonna replace the rotors, I'm gonna replace the pads. So why not salvage what I have for now? And then maybe this will take me easily into the fall. So when I come back to school in September, I could do the brakes at that time, or maybe even later on, maybe closer to the winter. So what have I done so far? What I did so far was I kind of service up the pads. And again, if I'm into this car for an inspection, it's my vehicle, I might as well put this back together. I know what when I test drive it, guys, I'll find out whether or not I was successful. I do believe though what I've done will make it successful, but I still have to test drive the vehicle, and that will mean that I have to drive the vehicle in excess of 80 kilometers an hour and feel how the brake pedal feels when I apply the brakes, okay? So here's what we've done. Here's what I've done. I lubed up my hub. I took my rotor, and if you notice what the rotor looked like before, I took my rotor, and what I did was I took it to a machine over there. It's called a brake lathe. And I just kind of cleaned up the surface a little bit. So the surface is a little bit cleaner. But mostly what I did was I couldn't get rid of the massive rust slip that was on the back. But what I did was I managed to kind of take off most of it. So right now this surface is nice and smooth, okay? So it's level and it's smooth. One of the things that I'm going to show you is the brake pad and where it was worn. So if we're looking at this rotor, we had a rust slip here. So that rust slip was actually, if we're looking at the rotor, it was actually raised. So the rust was raised on the rotor. When we're looking at the pads now, I'm going to bring the pad over. This is the inside pad. And what I did was I sanded the pad. All I did was I sanded it on a flat surface with some sandpaper. But what you'll notice about the pad is this, okay? The pad is sanded here, and it's not quite sanded here because that rust surface that was raised has worn down this pad more at the edge than on the inside. So now by doing what I just did, the entire surface is flat again. Then that means my pad, instead of touching here first at the raised surface where the rust was, now the entire pad will flatten out as I drive, and hopefully the pad will start to wear even. So if I was to put my finger in here, I can literally put my finger in this groove here, and I can feel that it's lower than the rest of the pad. So let's get these rotors back on, and let's get the pads back in. So I'm gonna put the rotor back on. Now, no one really does this anymore in industry. In the past, we used to machine rotors. Why? Because rotors were quite expensive. Rotors in the past, especially at the dealership, to tell you the truth, guys, if you're still going to the dealership, rotors will probably still cost you a minimum of about $100, depending on who the manufacturer is. If you're driving a high-end car, a Mercedes, a BMW, depending on the type of the car, the rotors could cost upwards of, and I know this sounds crazy, $700. Okay, so if you're looking at a brake job and you're looking at $700 for one rotor, that's $1,400 just for two rotors. $1,400 for two rotors. 2 or 3 hours in labor, $300 for labor. And you're looking at pads, and the pads would probably cost you $200, $300. So you've got $1,700 plus $300 in labor. You're looking at $2,000 for a brake job, but that's on a higher end vehicle. I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you guys, but one of my students came back, I think I did, right? His mechanic told him $280 for front brakes. Now this was just a Camry, so it was like a 2001 Camry, I believe. It's his first car. He managed to get some brake pads for like $50, and he installed them simply because he did it in the class here. And what he realized, it wasn't too difficult. His dad gave him a hand, and they got it done. So for $50, he got his brake pads. And the brakes, not as good as if you replace pads and rotors, but the brakes are still good because now you've got fresh pads with fresh linings, and that should carry you, that'll carry him for at least a year. Now, I've got the rotor installed. Rotor's installed. I've lubricated underneath the rotor. I didn't need to, but I add some additional lubricant anyhow. I'm going to swing the rotor back out. Okay, I want to swing the rotor back out. I'm going to put on my bracket, caliper bracket. Caliper bracket is here. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the wire brush and I'm just going to clean these spots here where the pads touch. So when the pads go back into the caliper bracket, if I show you it this way, okay, here's the caliper bracket right here, and I'm going to show you it here. When the pads go back in, take a look at where the pads touch. Okay, so when the pad goes back in, the pad touches in this area right here. It touches here and it touches here. So again, when I put the brake pad back in, I'm going to lubricate all those points where the pads slide. Now, these pads are sliding just fine. These pads are sliding just fine. However, I'm still going to add some lubricant because I'm here. I'm also going to add some lubricant here and here where the forks touch, where the caliper forks touch the pads, okay? Why? That's going to reduce some of my squeaks and vibrations and rattles, okay? That's just going to help so that as I'm driving the car and as I'm using the brakes, it will reduce noise, all right? Not a lot of noise, but it will reduce some noise. Caliper bracket, I'm going to clean it up. What I'm going to use on it is a wire brush. And the wire brushes I keep in cabinet M. And here's a wire brush. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a quick brush, and it'll take no time at all. I'm just going to bend down and get that done. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. So I've just brushed this side here. Let's see if I can show it to you. So I brushed this side here, all right? And that took me all of 10 seconds. And if you look at this side, I haven't brushed it as yet, all right? So when I brush it, it's gonna look like this side. I'm just gonna clean it up. And now that I've cleaned it up, I've got a fresh surface to put my lubricant on, okay? So my caliper bracket's gonna go back in here. Here's what I did with the bolt. So the bolt looked like this. What I did was I added a little bit of lubricant to this bolt here, and I'm not adding a lot, okay? So when I'm adding my lubricant, I'm not adding a whole bunch of lubricant. I just have a little bit of lubricant, okay, on my brush, and then I take my bolt. I'm just adding a little bit of lubricant. I'm not adding a whole bunch. Guys, once we spin this bolt in the matching nut, okay, that lubricant is going to spread all over, and we don't need a lot. Now, these bolts were lubed in the past. It's just they haven't been lubed in years, probably. All right. So let's get my brake stop, my steering stop in, my bolts in. So my bolts are going in. And my steering stop's going in. The bolt's going in. Now, this is the tricky part. And I know I make it look easy, but when I get you guys in the shop, I always have a good laugh because, you know, you guys can never line up the bolt with the hole. And what I always tell my students is you've got to take the time and you've got to line up the hole with the bolt, because if the bolt doesn't line up with the hole and you're trying to put it in the hole, it won't work. You've got to line up the male, okay, with the female, and once it goes in, then we can screw the bolt into the nut. But if you can't line it up, you can't ever get it in. So I've got them all lined up. My bolt is in line with my nut. I'm just gonna do this. So what I'm gonna do is slightly different than what I did when I took it off. So I'm gonna just tighten up. I'm gonna tighten up my bolts with my ratchet. One. Good. So now, to final tighten it, I don't like to use the ratchet. I just don't trust it. So for my final tightening, I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to use this one because the handle is a little bit too small. All right. So I'm going to take this one. And if you notice the difference in size, okay. So this one here is 9 inches and this one here is probably, this one's 9, this one's probably maybe 16 or 17 inches. So the difference in length, you can't really see it. The difference in length is, excuse me, I'm so sorry. The difference in length will give me a heck of a lot more torque or twisting force, okay, with this one. I'm going to use this one. I'm going to put my 50 millimeter ratchet on it, socket on it. My socket is going on my ratchet, and then I'm just going to tighten it with this ratchet, okay? And once I know I've tightened it by hand with this ratchet, I know that it's going to be okay. So, one, and every single bolt on every piece of equipment has a torque specification. So if I was to look in a book, okay, or if I was to look on Motronic and Electu, they would tell me the torque spec for this bolt and for this bolt. I just don't need it. I know how tight they are. I've had so many years of experience. I don't really have to worry about that. I know that I put those bolts in pretty tight, and I'm okay. What am I going to do next? I'm going to put my outside pad on, but let's turn this. Okay, so I'm going to put my outside pad on, and you can see, if you can see the surface of my rotor, it looks a little bit different than it did earlier. So when I put my pad back on, what I want to do is I want to lubricate my pad where it slides. Okay, so you can see that there was some residual lube there from before, but all I'm going to do is I'm going to lubricate my pad where it slides. Now, this pad is the outside pad, and this pad was sanded, and you can clearly see that my surface is fairly flat. If I sand it down a little bit more, I'll actually get rid of this glazing on the pad. So let me just take it to the sandpaper while I'm here with you guys. I'm just going to sand it. I've got sandpaper on the ground with this hard and flat, and I'm just sanding this brake pad, and I'm just removing the glazing on the pad. All right, so I've removed most of the glazing on the pad. I'm not going to spend any more time on it, but I've got most of the glazing off. There's a little tiny bit of glazing left right here, but I'm not too concerned about it right now. My pad material is good, and because it's free of dust and lubricant specifically and glazing, it should be a little bit more sticky, if you want to call it that, okay? So I'm going to lubricate here, and I'm going to lubricate here. Trust the brush. Okay, with a little bit of lubricant, I'm going to lubricate here where it slides, and I'm also going to lubricate right here where it slides. So any place where the pad slides or it comes in contact with the caliper, I'm lubricating it. So there we go. So now, put it on, done. I've got this thing here, okay, and that thing there is like a little shim, and what that shim does, it helps this pad, okay, helps to reduce the vibrations from the brake pad, okay. It also helps to reduce some of the noise And I'm just going to put it back on where it came off. So it came off right here. Put it back on right here. And then what I'm going to do, what I told you guys is I'm going to lubricate it where the forks of the caliper touch the pad. So again, I'm just going to add a little bit of lube. So what we're doing here is called the brake surface. I'm just adding a little bit of lube. And that's where the forks of the caliper touch the pads. Now, what I'm going to do next is I have to install the inside brake pad. So the inside brake pad is the brake pad with this clip. And this clip allows us to put it into the caliper, all right? So the piston of the caliper is a circle. It's always circular, all right? And I'm going to add a little bit of lube where it touches the caliper, piston. And I'm not going to put any lube here because we don't want any lube there because that's supposed to kind of stick into the piston of the caliper. Bring this caliper down and maybe you'll see it. So bring this down and you guys can see it in the camera. Yes, perfect. So getting pretty lucky here today, guys. I've got this camera kind of set up pretty neat. So I've got my piston right here on my caliper. So there's my round piston on my caliper. And there's a little bit of rust in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a screwdriver. And again, it's just in preparation for putting this brake pad back in because that brake pad's back with clips. And they're going to hold on the inside of the caliper. So it's kind of banging out the rust. You can see the rust falling out. Okay. I don't need to lubricate this at all because it doesn't slide in there at all. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of lubricant to the surface of my piston. So my piston is right here. And if I add a little bit of lubricant, the surface of my piston, that will lubricate where it touches the pad. And again, I'm not going crazy with the lubricant. I'm just adding just enough lubricant to allow the piston inside the caliper where it touches the brake pad to be cushioned. So again, I'm taking my brush. Take a look, guys. Look, there's the circle. There's the circle from the piston in the caliper. I'm just going to do this. I'm just doing this. I'm just adding a little bit of lube right where the caliper touches. Caliper piston touches the pad. That's it. So I've put it here. I've put it right here on the female surface, and I put it right here on the male surface. Now I'm calling this the male because this is going into the female, and then these two are going to mate together, right? So let's do this. I'm going to push this back in with my clips, and I've got the 3 clips. I'm just going to push it into the tray. And then once I get it in right, my pad just kind of stays there. So my pad is going to go in with my caliper. What else I could do is, just like the outside pad, I'm going to add a little bit of lubricant to where the inside pad slides. So I'm just going to add a little bit of lubricant here, here, and here. And that's exactly where the pad slides. It's exactly like the outside one. It slides on the inside. If I show you this, and again, these are some of the things that I can show you because I'm doing this live. I can show you some of the little tricks, the trade that you learn. So when you're pulling, let me just pull this pad back up. When you're pulling things apart, and you want to know, all right, so I'm looking for signs to figure out where these things go. So one of the signs I said, when you're pulling brake pads out and you don't know which one's the inside one and which one's the outside one, the inside one always has the circle for the piston for the caliper. Caliper piston, circular. Mark on my pad, circular. Forks from the caliper will be fork marks on the outside. So that's the outside pad, this is the inside pad. Now just take a look at this. Maybe I can show it to you on the camera. How do I know where these brake pads slide? I get my pointer. So when we're looking at these brake pads, okay, I've got a dirty section right here. I got a dirty section right here, and up on the top, I have a dirty section. That means it's not really rubbing against anything. But let's take a closer look right here. Do you see that shiny part right there? Oh yeah, you see the light reflecting off it right here? You've got that shiny part there because that metal, you can tell that metal is rubbing against something else, and that's keeping it shiny. Now, I don't want the shininess. I prefer to put some lubricant on it because I know that my brake pad is sliding back and forth on this point right here. So, lube, I just put lube there. I showed you guys I put lubricant there. I'm gonna put more lubricant here because that's where the pad is sliding. Again, get my brush. I'm not putting an excessive amount of lubricant. I've got my brush, I've got lube on my brush. I add my lubricant here. And now I've got a brake pad that has lubricant where it's gonna move, and that should help it. It should help it slide back and forth, right? Let's get it back into the piston on the caliper. Okay, so now I've got my pad back into my piston on my caliper. Now all I do is I slide it back over my assembly, and then I've got to bolt it back up. So I took this bolt out. For the hanger. So I'm just going to put it back in. Before I put it back in, you guys know what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to put a little bit of lube. The difference is I cannot use the lube that I'm using on the brake pads on the slider pin. So my slider pin, I don't want to use this synthetic lubricant because I'm going to be sliding this into a rubber boot. And that synthetic lubricant is great for metal on metal. It's just not great for metal on rubber. So I've got a separate lubricant that I've got to get, and I'm going to bring it out. So I've got this, and I'm just wiping it up so that you guys can see it in the camera. And it's like a little plastic bottle. It's still a synthetic lubricant. So you can clearly see it says synthetic lubricant. So it's still a synthetic lubricant, but this lubricant is meant for metal that's going to be rubbing against rubber. Okay, so I don't even have to pull it out. There's a little brush in here. I'm just going to add just a little bit to this. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow this thing to slide a little bit easier. So I'm just adding a little bit, spread it around. Okay, so the entire thing now is lubed. All right, and I'm going to push it back into my rubber boot that it goes into. So it kind of fits into like a rubber housing. And that rubber housing is what gives it its protection from the elements. All right, so that bolt looks like brand new, even though it's 15 years old, because it's inside a rubber boot. All right, and that boot is protecting it. I guess there isn't really any other way for me to describe it. So it's kind of like, you know, you've got your bolt going through, and you've got this protective rubber boot that's over it, okay? And that's keeping it looking like brand new 15 years later. So now let's do this. Back on. Pad over. I'm going to make sure my forks go over my other brake pad on the outside. Got everything back together. I could give this a scrub. I could give this a scrub with my wire brush, all right? But there isn't a lot of rust on it. These cars are pretty good. The Europeans generally, they cost a little bit more, but they put the, what they do is they put better metal in their product, and that's why the cars do cost a little bit more. They do put better metal, okay, better components on their vehicles. What I just did there was I just kind of quickly wire brushed my bleeder screw on my caliper. I'm just putting, again, there's a little rubber boot, and that little rubber boot kind of protects the tip of my bleeder screw. I'm just putting it on. Okay, so now I'm going to catch my two bolts. And in order for me to catch my two bolts, I want to catch them by hand. I don't want to catch them by my ratchet, because if I try and catch it with my air ratchet, it might create a problem where I cross thread my bolts. So I'm just going to catch this by hand. If it doesn't work, I'm going to put it on my air ratchet. So that one's caught. I'm just going to wiggle. I'm wiggling my caliper around. Why? Because I want to make sure that I find the matching hole for my bolt. So I found it and I've caught it. So right now my caliper's tight. That's the electric ratchet. I'm going to tighten it up with the ratchet. Oops, sorry. And then I'm going to do this one here. I'm just going to tighten it up with my ratchet. So I've got the two bolts going into the caliper, holding it to the caliper bracket tightened. can't forget these. I can't forget these little end caps for my boot, okay? So I've got two of them, two little end caps. I'm gonna pop it back on. Again, that's gonna protect my bolts from rusting. Then, really, really important, okay? When you guys are doing this, oh my gosh, you don't know how many times I've gone back to a vehicle and someone has forgotten to do this. Now, I know the light's not really shining here. Good. Can you guys see that better? No, we just shine this in here. Is that better? There we go. So you guys can see the coil spring, all right? The light's kind of hidden because of just the position of my light over there. But on here, we've got the little, let me slide out a bit here. You can see it there. We've got that piece of wire that we were using to hang the caliper. You gotta remember, guys, if you're doing any of this stuff at home or you're doing any of this stuff here, you wanna make sure that you take that little piece of wire out of that little hanger, because that little piece of wire or that hanger, when the customer's driving the car, it could either A, make noise, or B, get in the way of something that has to move. And if it gets in the way of something that has to move, and it happens to be your brake hose, and this is made out of metal, and the brake hose is made out of rubber with some sort of textile material underneath that gives it the strength, it could puncture it, it could do damage to it. So you want to make sure that when you've got your hanging wire or hanger on here, you want to remove it, okay? I've also found my lights. In here, because what will happen is students will bring the light, and the light's got a magnet, right? And the light can stay like that. It can also stay in this position here, right? So if they're using this and they want to see stuff, they can shine the light like this. They can have it on here, and then when they put the wheel back on, they forget the light. One of the things that I practice while we're in the shop is you guys do the work, and I trust you guys to do the work. I can't trust you that much because the only person in here that has a license is me. So what I normally say is, guys, yep, put the wheels on, torque it all up, and then I'm going to come over and I'm still going to check it, even though you've torqued it. While you guys leave, you're on lunch, pier's over, whatever, or if the pier's not over, I check it in front of you. And what I do is I check all the bolts to make sure that they're tight to my specifications, okay? So I want to make sure that I'm happy with how tight they are. And then I also kind of take a quick look behind the tire just to make sure stuff like this isn't left on the car. Because if you leave a light like this in the car, what ends up happening is you crush it. And there goes a $200 light, right? So, done. What else do I have to do, guys? Remember what else I took off of this? I took this off. Let me just slide this over. So the other part that I took off of this was the spring. And I call that spring an anti-rattle spring. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to slip it back in just like yesterday. I'm going to position it the right way, right? So that anti-rattle spring prevents this from kind of vibrating, moving around, okay? And then it also kind of touches the brake pad right here. There's a little piece of rubber. So if I kind of zoom in here, there's two little tiny pieces of rubber, right? So you see that piece of rubber there and that piece of rubber there? They kind of touch the pad, but they're made out of rubber, which is cool. So put this on. It touches the pad, prevents the pad from vibrating, prevents this from vibrating. And what that does is it reduces a lot of noise. Okay, so I'll just slide this back in. And you can tell I've done this many, many times, right? Not as easy as I make it look. I always get students again trying to do this. And sir, I can't do it. And it's just a matter of positioning everything properly, and through experience, I can put this spring on onto this caliper here quite easily, all right? Front brakes are done. Hopefully, fingers crossed, what I did today, especially with that huge rust lip on the back, helps. Now, I